Hello, folks. Thank you for taking the time to tune into this webinar on the benefits of incorporating engineering simulation into your device development programs. I am Paul O'Connor, Director of Medical Development from Boston Engineering, and I am joined by Jim Shaw, who is the Director of Simulation. Today, we'll be reviewing several case studies pertaining to molecular diagnostics and diagnostic imaging. We will also be discussing the recent advancements related to the ever-increasing acceptance of computer simulation data in support of regulatory submissions. You will learn how to apply engineering simulation to tackle your product design challenges, increase your level of confidence in your regulatory submissions, and how engineering simulation ultimately increases the safety and efficacy of your products. So let's review a few case studies. Point of care testing is analytical testing performed outside of a central lab environment using devices that can be easily transported to be close to patients. The value of near-patient testing for routine infectious disease diagnosis is important, given that the real-time test results can dictate timely treatment and improve clinical outcomes. With the increasing threat of accelerated epidemic to pandemic transitions of new or re-emerging infectious disease outbreaks, decentralizing the diagnostic testing to be closer to frontline clinical settings will facilitate earlier implementations of public health responses to contain and mitigate such events. This project involved a number of elements that were unique to the market at that time. It analyzed up to 20 different sets of data at the same time. And some of the design challenges, they mostly focused around the electronics. The temperature inside the device, the signal to noise ratio, as well as the electronic emission and shielding. This next case study was a very extensive project to design, develop, and commercialize a real-time polymerase chain reaction, PCR, system for lab-based use. The system monitors the amplification of a targeted DNA molecule during the PCR process. Real-time PCR enables simultaneous amplification and product detection without additional post-PCR processing. With the ever-increasing number of genomes of infectious pathogens being sequenced, catalogs of genes can be exploited to serve as amplification targets fundamental to the design of clinically useful diagnostic tests. As a result, the number of PCR assays developed to identify specific pathogens by amplifying unique sequences continues to expand. This market segment will continue to experience significant growth for the foreseeable future. Taking a look under the hood of this system, you can start to gain an appreciation for the complexity of the device and the associated design challenges. A valve with more than 12 ports, the need for pressure equalization, the timing of samples, the mixing dynamics, dwell times, and critical temperature control are just a few of the performance parameters that needed to be considered. Now, next up is Jim to speak about the specific examples of how simulation can be applied to these types of devices.
Great, thanks, Paul. We can't really dig into too many details as much as I'd love to lift the hood on those two projects, but what they have in common is either measuring or managing fluid. And so from a simulation perspective, that's really the category of what we call computational fluid dynamics, or CFD for short. So I've got 4 examples here I'd like just to kind of explain a little bit on where we see CFD directly applying to molecular diagnostics. So the first would be that upper left-hand corner. And Paul even mentioned it a little bit earlier about valve design. When we have a fluid circuit, we're managing either the pumps or the control system, and particularly the pressure drop through the system. In some cases, we may have to design a bespoke valve to work. And so for that, we can easily analyze the fluid flow, whether it's a liquid or a gas or a mixture operating through that valve. On the upper right-hand corner, we've got a classic case of what we call mixing. And again, a fluid includes both liquids and gases. And so CFD has the capability nowadays to mix either two liquids or multiple liquids. We call that multiple species mixing. It can also mix several gases or a liquid gas combination, and in some cases, even a phase change. So if something, for example, we boil or we add a lot of energy to the system, we can actually predict how a liquid might turn into a gas, all done with CFD. The bottom left-hand corner is particularly interesting for particle and filtration analysis. And you can imagine we've got applications like I've got a fluid system. Maybe there's particulates that are within the fluid and I want to separate it, right? Perhaps a centrifuge system, or maybe for whatever reason, I want to introduce some sort of particles into a fluid and suspend them in some way. And so all of that can play a role in building a CFD model. We can account for the mass of the particles. We can account for their impact on the fluid. And then probably most importantly, we can actually design the filtration system to work for a certain flow rate or a certain pressure drop or something. The last application in molecular diagnostics, which is particularly special, is the electronics cooling. So everything nowadays has some sort of smart aspect to it, right? I've got a microcontroller, I've got sensors, maybe I'm processing data on the fly. But what we've got is we've got tighter and tighter packages that we're trying to put electronics into. That means we've got higher and higher power densities. And many, many times it's not desirable to put a fan, for example, on a small desktop machine. We don't want to hear the fan. We don't want to worry about that additional power requirement. So many, many times we want to design an electronic system to cool itself, if you will, or do passive cooling. So these are 4 applications I just kind of chose to, specifically talk about molecular diagnostics. But the bottom line is what we're able to do with CFD is predict the system level performance before we go into either the prototyping or the testing phase.
All right. Thank you, Jim. So our next case study is a bidirectional X-ray machine. And it captures 2 images from 2 planes at the same time, which represents a major advance in the field of diagnostic imaging. The goal of this project was to perform a complete redesign of the mechanical systems based on customer feedback. The design challenges were a set of requirements that were fighting each other. It's a classic situation of conflicting requirements needing a comprehensive design effort to overcome usability issues. As an example, it is very easy to over-design the mechanical structures to maximize stability. This runs up against the desire to maximize portability, particularly with shipping and setup. Maneuverability in a hospital environment where space is at a premium is extremely difficult due to the size, weight, and system locking features. Macro motion as well as micro adjustments are required to position the arm correctly around the patient. Multiple repositionings can lead to breaching the sterile field and result in surgical delays. I've listed some of the obvious factors that needed to be considered during the design and analysis process. So you can see, weight, stability, image quality, kinematics, vibration. Those are all the requirements that need to be considered, and they couldn't conflict with each other. So Jim, do you see any opportunities to apply simulation tools?
Of course, particularly with diagnostic imaging, I think this is a classical application for what we call structural analysis, also known as finite element analysis, or FEA. And a lot of us mechanical engineers have heard of this and have even used it. But I've got 4 applications here that I think, again, are particularly specific to diagnostic imaging. Again, upper left-hand corner, we see electronics reliability. And so that can transcend both the sort of keep it cool thermal world that we just talked about, but also the keep it safe in the structural world. And sometimes we have, maybe not with a large machine, but in smaller machines, we have maybe drop and shock requirements that, or maybe shipping requirements, right? So the very specifically calibrated imaging machines. So we have to make sure that the electronics are going to be reliable through that. Upper right-hand corner, we've got 4 classic applications of FEA: stiffness, strength, fatigue, and fracture. And basically what those 4 words mean are my parts going to bend? And if so, how much? If they do bend, are they going to break? If they're going to break, is it going to be the first time, or is it going to be after, 1,000 cycles or 10,000 cycles? And then if it does break, how is that going to impact the system? Can we withstand, say, a microfracture somewhere in the system that no one knows about? Or as soon as we have a fracture, do we have to be concerned? So very classical applications here for stress analysis, if you will. Bottom right-hand corner, we've got a very specific case here to the imaging world, which is kinematics and robotics. And so with imaging, we typically have some sort of motorized mechanism of some sort that at the end or somewhere in that kinematic chain, we have a very specific, precise camera, for lack of a better word, or a sensor set. And so controlling that is very important, and then making sure that we have good joint design is extremely important. We don't want these things to drift or to have any sort of structural hysteresis as we're grabbing an image. And robotics, of course, and it transcends sort of imaging, but any sort of motorized multi-link system is something that we're going to want to simulate on the computer before we prototype. The last, I think, piece of the puzzle, at least for diagnostic imaging, and what we've seen is what we call advanced materials. So polymers and composites in particular. Polymers, and we've got a lot of friends in the area who are customizing and custom engineering a very specific polymer to do a very specific task. And the tooling for that can get expensive. So obviously any simulation we can do is really going to accelerate that development cycle. And then composites, as we get to stiffer and stiffer materials that are lighter and lighter, as Paul mentioned, stability. Stability to me as a mechanical engineer means it needs to be stiff, and it needs to be solid, and it needs to be very light so I can maneuver it. So composites are really the world where we can design our own material properties for a given panel, say a sandwich panel or something like that. So big picture, I think, for the structural analysis world is the ability to predict system tolerances. Once we build these models, we can understand what are the manufacturing tolerances and how is that going to impact particularly our image quality.
Right. So switching gears a little bit, the regulatory approval process creates its own set of challenges during the development that have to be considered. There are many ways to outline this process. However, it all comes down to documented evidence to ensure patient safety. Some of the traditional sources of evidence include bench testing, animal models, and clinical trials. The purpose of each stage of testing and evaluation is intended to de-risk the product or the system in terms of end user or patient safety. You can see that the scale of investment for each type of testing is outlined, and the key to all of this testing, regardless of type, is to minimize the number of variables to enable a credible, statistically significant set of results. As you can see, the time and cost to perform these studies can be substantial, and there really is no guarantee that the results will be what you expected. Now, this results in very difficult discussions, follow-up studies, or even program cancellation. It's very difficult or impossible to physically test every configuration in what-if scenarios during these tests. So there are new tools available, and computer-based or in silico simulation. The benefits of computer simulation: you can augment or replace testing elements very easily. You can rapidly iterate your designs without the need to destructively test anything. In fact, it's really expensive. You can easily vary the design inputs into your test, so you can really press in on the extremes of the performance of your device. You can press the outer limits of your testing. You can quickly identify your critical to quality elements to improve reliability. You're obviously eliminating build times, and you can dramatically increase your sample size. And you can get to a very strong level of statistical significance. Historically, the evidence for safety and efficacy that companies provided to regulatory agencies in support of clearance for a medical device have been produced experimentally, either in vitro or in vivo. More recently, regulatory agencies have started receiving and accepting evidence obtained in silico, meaning computer-based modeling and simulation. To quote from FDA, the FDA advocates for the use of engineering simulation as one of the many research and product development tools because they play a critical role in organizing diverse data sets, exploring alternate study design strategies, and predicting performance so that safe and effective new therapeutics can advance more efficiently, from preclinical all the way through to clinical trials to market. It is also safe to say that the broader use of computer-based simulation will reduce the cost to the overall healthcare system. For a look to the future of engineering simulation, Jim will outline the potential for some of the advanced simulation techniques.
Yeah, here's a great, what we call a multi-physics case study. So here's an example where, as we're designing a new MRI machine, one of the things that we need to consider is the potential for a patient being inside of the machine with an implant. And so as we are creating images with the MRI machine, we're actually passing electromagnetic interference through the human. So we're absorbing some of that electromagnetic energy. And some of that energy gets converted to heat in what we call Joule heating. And different materials absorb heat at different rates. In particular, if we had an implant that was not made of soft tissue, for example, here we've got sort of a knee implant, that could heat up significantly quicker than the soft human tissue around it. And so we need to be careful of that, right? We want to make sure we keep the patient comfort and certainly pain and risk completely minimized. So the typical process right now during MRI sort of beta testing or final testing would be to use what we call a phantom. And so the phantom has a human-like shape, and you can see in the upper right-hand corner, we've got this polystyrene sort of foam box that from an MRI standpoint is similar in imaging from soft tissue. And then inside that box, we'll put in some foreign objects that would represent the material of, say, for example, a knee implant. Well, you can probably see, of course, that the shape of that box and the representation of that box in reality isn't really anything like a human. And so an example of a multi-physics analysis would be to use our electromagnetic software to build up that energy and absorb the energy into the human, and then convert that to heat and predict the temperature, for example, of a knee implant. And we can see that sort of workflow down at the bottom. A lot of these human models we can download now online. That's one of the great things that is as we continue to sort of make the simulation tools available. And that's one of the things that Paul just mentioned, as these models, human models, become available to users of software, that reduces some of the statistical variance that we see in real life, and we're able to run statistical analyses on whether or not this particular patient, for example, would if their knee would heat up too much. So in many cases, and the technology and simulation is moving quickly, so the story could change in even 6 months from now. But in many cases, even today, the model, there's less variability in the model than there is in real life.
All right, thanks, Jim. So in summary, simulation can reduce variability in your product development process. You can build confidence with your regulatory submissions, and you can increase, and all of that leads to an increase in your product safety and efficacy. There's results of a survey here from the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, and it shows the occurrence essentially of using computer simulation data. And it's already being used in a significant percentage of regulatory submissions. And that usage is increasing at a fairly dramatic rate. So it's out there, it's available to be used, and it has a tremendous benefits to your product development process. So Jim and I would like to thank you all for attending. I understand that some folks may need to drop off. However, we do have a few minutes remaining to answer some questions.
We actually already have 2 questions. The first question that's been submitted is, what CAD tools are you currently using for modeling? And if there are other questions, please enter them in the Q&A and we'll bring them up during this session. Jim, do you want to address that question?
Great, thanks. We actually have partnerships today with PTC and Ansys, and PTC has a full suite of software for CAD modeling, and Ansys has a full suite of software for simulation. If the person asking that question is looking for software, I think some of the things they need to consider, of course, is that software going to be able to work for them across the whole product development process. So we don't really call it just CAD anymore, because we're not just creating geometry. We're actually building out entire models, from conceptual and mathematical models all the way down to production, quality management, change management, things like that.
Thank you. Our second question is, how simulation can justify glucose monitoring results?
Monitoring, like live monitoring? I don't know if we have that.
Samia, if you want to type in a little bit more about your question, we can answer whether you want that for live results, or a little more detail will help us. In the meantime, one other question that we have is, what is driving the FDA's increased approval of simulation?
It looks like Samia answered, so I'll finish that question up.
Great.
So in regards to lab results, so when you ask, how does simulation justify glucose monitoring results? There's a couple ways to answer that. If you want to build a simulation model that's connected to live testing, that's absolutely available. There's a whole suite of system level tools. Think of like LabVIEW meets a finite element analysis tool, where we call it sort of the IoT, if you will. It's called Twin Builder for the Ansys software, but basically we're connecting live sensors to live data to bring it into a database, and that database can either feed into the inputs or the boundary conditions of an analysis, or you can already have an analysis completed, and you can be measuring and comparing the results of the analysis to the data on the fly. So that would be an application where we're really doing testing and simulation sort of hand in hand. Other ways for justifying the use of simulation, well, again, it's how you justify the cost of the tests that you have to do, right? And Paul had a slide up earlier with the cost of some of the evidence that we have to create for the FDA, and those costs can be astronomical. The cost of simulation is one that you can actually amortize over, say, the life of the product or even the life of the company, which means it can get quite low.
Actually, while we're talking about pricing, Paul, we had a question submitted. All of the simulation seemed expensive. How is it saving any cost?
Yeah, that's a very routine question that we get. If you apply the simulation well, it can really impact your design, build, test model, which is your traditional test. There is a ton of expensive waste with this model, especially when you have to do multiple iterations, and especially if the testing is destructive. So simulation allows you to test iterations efficiently and consistently and minimize the variables of some of those other traditional tests.
Thank you. Jim, a question that was submitted was, what is driving the FDA's increase in approval of simulation?
That's a great question. And I don't have insight directly into the FDA. My feeling is, and where a lot of our partners and colleagues who are using this, number one, statistical significance, right? So, I know that the sort of standard practice is to include, empirical evidence, right? And that empirical evidence has a huge dependency on the patient, whether it's, in vivo, in vitro, whether it's a human, whether it's an animal. There's a lot of statistical variance in that. And trying to remove that can make for some pretty creative writing, I think, in many of the applications to the FDA with varied success. When you build a computer model out, it's really just a glorified math problem, right? And so just like any math problem, I've got inputs and outputs. I can take any of those inputs. It could be, as we showed, the geometry of a patient. It could be the material of the knee implant. It could be the design of a valve, right? We can take any of those inputs and we can slide them back and forth. And we call that a sensitivity analysis. When we build out a whole database of what if scenarios in the computer, which we can do significantly faster and cheaper than real life, it builds an extremely compelling case for the FDA. You can basically highlight exactly where the potential error is before the regulators find it and say, hey, what did you think about this? Did you think about that? You can basically kind of nip it in the bud.
Paul, we've got a couple questions asking, will simulation replace clinical trials, or another question was, will it completely ever replace testing?
Yeah, that's a very big question. We're likely a ways away from that. However, there are many simulation projects underway that are attempting to simulate parts of the human body, where 3D modeling is now used in many surgical procedures. It's only really a natural progression that we'll be able to analyze these 3D models at some point to really dictate course of treatment.
Thank you. Jim, one other question we have a couple more to go, but one other question that's for you. What if I don't have an expert in simulation on my team? How easy is it to learn? I think that's a great question.
Yeah, that's probably the second most popular question we get after how much does it cost. There's a couple different ways to kind of tackle that. The first is, and this is really a bigger picture question about your business model, is are you looking to build and invest in your engineering team? If the answer is yes, and we get this a lot with the smaller companies and startups, is listen, I don't have the team in place yet, but the business plan includes, say, next round of funding, and I got to hire 5 to 10 engineers, and where do I want them to be? So in those cases, there's service providers who can build a model for you. They can transfer the model to you, for example. We've done that on a number of cases where customers aren't ready for the software and for the knowledge base in-house, and so they say outsource it, for lack of a better word. The other is trying to build a business case internally for bringing that knowledge in-house. When it comes time to, say, justify the cost of the tool, now there becomes the other two pieces of the puzzle, right? So there's 3 things that we need: software, hardware, and knowledge. And so on that knowledge piece, there's a whole host of resources, training resources, both passive and active. Passive being databases online, videos online, Q&A. There's whole courses. There's a whole entire 16-week courses online. And then in particular, not maybe so much now, but maybe when it gets safe to do so, there's also in-person training, which is much more sort of dense and impactful, and you can squeeze a lot in 3 days.
Thank you. Does simulation support sufficient IP findings?
Paul, you want to tackle that?
Could you repeat the question, Victoria?
Does simulation support sufficient IP filings?
Sufficient IP filings.
And the individual who submitted that question, maybe you want to add a little more detail. What we'll do is we'll go to another question and then we'll come back to that one. How accurate are simulations? Jim, can you help us with that?
Yeah. And they're as accurate as you want them to be. Let's put it that way. As much time and effort you have to make them accurate. No, the answer to that is just like any other math problem. We've got inputs and outputs, and the accuracy of the output is directly related to the accuracy of the input. And an example would be, if I was doing a composite or a polymer, one of those advanced materials that we had shown on the imaging slide, I need to have the material properties pretty well defined in order for the stresses and the deflections to make sense. So it really depends on, have I characterized the problem well? If the answer to that is yes, you've got material properties and you've got the loads and boundary conditions, it's generally expected that we can get, say between 5 to 10% in the first go or two with somebody behind the helm who knows what they're doing. When you've got test data that you can use to tune, you can get within a few percent.
Fantastic. We don't have more insight on the IP filings, but we do have one other question, and this is our last question unless people want to submit some more. Oh, wait a minute. We just got a little bit more in. Hold on one second. He's asking, that is demonstrating novel versus other IP, use unique use or novel structure, patent filing.
The answer to that would be yes. So the more evidence that you can demonstrate that something is unique and novel, just strengthens your patent application. So I would say the answer to that is yes.
Thank you.
Can I add in one more thing, Victoria? Sorry.
Yeah.
Whether it's a design patent or it's a utility patent, right? So if it's a design patent and you're trying to grab IP around the form or the look of something like a handheld or a tool or maybe an implant, then if the shape of that design was a result of analysis, then the analysis is going to back up the shape, right? So we're directly impacting the design patent that you're pursuing. And we see that with handhelds and tools in the OR and in some cases with implants that have a unique or, if you're claiming something's like perfectly spherical, slightly parabolic, some sort of geometric claim, and that came from the result of a bunch of analyses, that can support it. And then of course, on the utility side, any claim that's in there, and a lot of IP lawyers and we deal with a bunch. You try to go broad at first to see what happens, and then you hold on tight. And when you're throwing 20 claims down, anytime you can back it up with simulation, and someone's going out there to look for prior art or bounce it off other claims, ultimately, it comes down to a person sitting down at an existing patent and your patent and trying to determine if there's a difference. If you can prove there's a difference, then it strengthens your case.
Thank you, Jim. Paul, we have one last question that's been submitted, and then I think you have some wrap-up comments. But the last question submitted is, in what market segment do you see simulation gaining the most traction?
Yeah. This is a very broad question. I can outline a couple of areas. Surgical robotics would certainly benefit from, FEA and haptic feedback simulation. And fluid analysis can obviously make a significant contribution to the cardiovascular devices and diagnostic equipment. Tissue ablation systems can also utilize thermal analysis. So there are many areas that are advancing more or less at the same rate, and that rate is a very fast rate. Okay, so that was the last question. So thanks again for joining us today. This topic has it's been very popular and it's generated a lot of interest. So we're going to be presenting again tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. If you have a friend or a peer that you think would like to send this invite to and they'd be interested in, they can register by visiting boston-engineering.com, clicking About, click Events, and then they can register. And then on Friday, we'll be sending you a link to this recording, and thereafter, there'll be several resources on simulation coming your way. We'd like to thank you all for your time and have a very nice evening. Thank you.
Thanks.